I'm not going to need the 15 minutes. I don't have 15 minutes worth of stuff to say. But I want to start this evening off by talking a little bit about the impetus, the genesis for the business of Black Power. And then Julie, my co-editor, is going to say a little bit more about our findings and our arguments. So as some of you here tonight will know that for the past 7 years, I've actually been researching the movement in Rochester, New York. Many people are familiar with Rochester's 19th century history, ripe with abolition and women's rights. But the 20th century story is equally, if not more important, for charting a national course for Black freedom. And the post-war Rochester story is one that clearly fit into Black Power narratives. The Nation of Islam was there, police brutality was rampant, folks organized around the issues, the housing was a problem, jobs were a problem, and much of the language and activity was consistent with that Black Power moment. But the thing about Rochester is that Eastman Kodak and the Xerox Corporation are headquartered there. And it was really complicating the story that I was trying to tell. It wasn't like other places, nor did it fit the debates that were really raging at the time in the long civil rights history, the kind of self-defense, nonviolent debates that were happening. Rochester just didn't fit any of that. And so all of this stuff, what was going on in Rochester, the ideas that were percolating there, were not consistent with the literature that I had read on Black Power. Now, this isn't really a time for me to further discuss my research on Rochester, but I raise all of that to say I felt very frustrated and very alone trying to figure out how the business elite, shareholders, the hardcore unemployed, not to mention community development corporations, fit with Black Power. So like many young researchers trying to avoid having to write in any concrete way, I started going to conferences. And what I found at those conferences was a new set of scholars facing the same lacuna in the literature that I was facing. How were they situating the work that they were doing in a literature that just didn't exist? Many of us were kind of stumbling and fumbling around trying to develop a language for the research that we'd found. A guy named Rob Goldberg was writing about a Black doll company in California. This guy, Josh Davis, in North Carolina, was writing about record stores and how those two companies intersected with Black Power. A woman named Nashani Frazier was writing about the Huff Development Corporation in Cleveland, Ohio. So all of a sudden, the economic dimensions, the organizing and the activism of the Black Power movement were popping up all over. And in every place, the scholars and the historians that I encountered shared my frustration writing about the business of Black Power. So in part, we blamed it on the literature, right? But in retrospect, in looking back now, having done the collection, I think a lot of this neglect stemmed from the activists themselves. They haven't always privileged the economic dimensions of their work, at least not those kind of self-styled Black Power folks. So I actually stumbled upon this element of business in the Black Power movement quite by accident. I didn't find it in the oral history interviews that I was doing with the activists who were involved in all of these movements. I actually found it in the business sections of papers, Business Weekly and the Wall Street Journal. Not places you go to look for Black Power stories, right? And so I found it in organizational meeting minutes. And once I knew to ask about it, the folks I was talking with, they were prepared to discuss it. They were prepared to talk about it. But when I went in talking about Black Power, they weren't equating the economic work they were doing with the Black Power movement. And I wish, you know, you always have 20/20 vision in hindsight. I wish I had talked to them about that piece of it, why they weren't ready to really kind of remember it in those ways. So I raise this here now because I think that introducing the book, first and foremost, there's so much work left to be done here. And I think that as historians, as scholars, as members of communities, if we aren't asking the right kinds of conversations in our research, if we're not asking the right kinds of questions in our conversations, those answers aren't going to come to the surface. And so I think the greatest thing that our book offers, and again, Julie's going to talk a little bit more about our findings and our arguments later, but I think the greatest thing that our collection offers is this raising of new questions. And now I'm calling them new questions, but in many ways, they're only new to historians and scholars, right? Those engaged in the business of Black Power faced those questions daily 40 and 50 years ago. So one of our fearless hosts today, Kamosi Woodard, was actually one of these activists who was involved in the business of Black Power. And he vacillated in his answer to some of these questions that we're raising. And so in telling his story, he actually offered to Julie and I what became an organizing principle of our book. He recalled at a previous confab, not altogether unlike this one, that when Amiri Baraka assigned him to do economic organizing, he thought he'd been given the shit detail, right? He thought he'd been given this job that nobody else wanted to do. He further clarified that it wasn't sexy, right? It wasn't African liberation. It wasn't the Gary Convention. What had he done to get this terrible assignment? But he came to appreciate that economic development was another aspect of grassroots organizing, and that it could ultimately create avenues to escape poverty. But historians, scholars, have only just begun to truly appreciate this kind of economic work. So I want to be clear here. I don't want there to be any mistake about this. Not everyone engaged in the business of Black Power shared Kamosi's pure heart, right? As Michael West points out in our conclusion, there were some real charlatans involved in the business of Black Power. And in fact, one of the aha moments of kind of putting this book together for me came when I read Michael's conclusion. He argues that Black Power was a big tent, and that all were welcome under the big tent. Among others, capitalists and socialists alike could cooperate under that tent. And it's this fundamental truth, that everyone was welcome under the big tent, that makes characterizing the business of Black Power so very difficult, but also so very important. And so before I hand this over to Julie, I want to briefly discuss an interesting commonality in the two books here. In the reviews to date, both of David and Trevor's Black Power at Work and the Business of Black Power, reviewers have been eager, almost desperate, to include in their evaluations a laundry list of what else this new literature should include, should take on, or tackle. And it makes me very excited to see so many of you here tonight, and to urge you, if you're a scholar, an academic, somebody with interest, if you have those people in your family, get them involved in this kind of research, because there are stories to tell out there that just simply have not been uncovered yet. I told you I was going to take 15 minutes. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and thanks to Professors Woodard and Theo Harris for putting this series together. So what I'm going to talk about is how we follow the business of Black Power in the book. The book recreates this moment when the debate over Black economic development raged widely across the political spectrum. It included Black activists and intellectuals, entrepreneurs, corporate executives, policymakers, and it unfolded in the pages of both newly founded magazines like Black Enterprise, like Essence, all the way to established publications like the New York Times and the Harvard Business Review. And the question animating this is, how could Black people use business broadly defined in our collection, for collective advancement in the 1960s and 70s? Now, this, of course, is not a new question, but it was being debated in a new context. The civil rights and Black Power movements had transformed the political ground on which the struggle was unfolding, but these changes also emphasized the need for economic justice. So we trace the historic roots of this debate over economic strategy and introduce some of the thinkers that revived it, or I'm going to introduce them in the 1960s and 70s. So some are calling for the adaptation of historical models. Harold Crews suggested a return to the cooperative commonwealth proposals that W.E.B. Du Bois had advanced nearly a generation ago at that point. Whitney Young proposed an ambitious domestic Marshall Plan to rebuild the social and physical infrastructure of American cities, much like the Marshall Plan had in Europe after World War II. Now, many of the fiercest debates that we found revolved around the viability of Black capitalism specifically. Now, for Young, for even Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Charles V. Hamilton, Black capitalism had parallels in the history of immigrant solidarity. Malcolm X, too, also counseled, as other ethnic groups have done, let the Black people, wherever possible, however possible, patronize their own kind, hire their own kind, and start in those ways to build up the Black race's ability to do for self. Now, for conservative politicians like Richard Nixon, Black capitalism promised to establish what the historian Robert Weems has called domestic détente with Black militants. Nixon's handful of small business policies and rhetorical celebrations of Black entrepreneurship would prove in his vision that, quote, those with energy and drive can share more equitably in the rewards of the world's most productive economic system. Yet, to its critics, Black capitalism was ineffective at best and destructive at its worst. A thorough Black exercise in mass self-delusion, according to Earl O'Farry Hutchinson. Black capitalism would only give white leaders another tool to divide Black communities and to undermine effective radicalism, according to others. Robert Allen's classic Black Awakening in Capitalist America, which kind of, that's a very important book that kind of influences us throughout the writing of this collection, turned readers' attention instead to internal colonialism. Like many others, Allen argued that American capitalism sustained underdevelopment and economic dependence in Black communities, much the way that imperial powers had done in foreign colonies. Uprooting internal colonialism required massive political resistance, not economic self-organization at the margins. So that was the position of Allen and many other critics. So this debate that I just kind of laid out in very rough terms, raged in editorials and manifestos and predictions and the kind of preliminary analysis of a movement that was in the making in the 60s and 70s. But by the late 1970s, as Robert Weems documents in his epilogue to our book, the discussion about Black capitalism and Black-led, Black-generated economic development had all but disappeared from the popular press. But we're asking, how was it playing out on the ground? What was its historical impact? And to find out, we turned with our contributors to a host of fine-grained local studies. And we're exploring the business of Black power in 4 thematic sections. We look at models of Black capitalism. We look at Black power in the culture industries. We look at housing and neighborhood economic development. And so now I just want to give you a few examples of what the contributors found when they did this research. Now, my co-editor, Laura Hill, and contributor Nishani Frazier demonstrate the fraught history of Black capitalism in their essays in the section called Black Capitalism in Pursuit of Black Power. And Laura's aptly titled essay, Fighting for the Soul of Black Capitalism, focuses on an early Black power organization in Rochester, New York, called FIGHT. Now, FIGHT confronted the city's corporate giants, the Kodak Company and the Xerox Company, two that I'm sure we've all heard of, over their discriminatory hiring policies and their paternalistic response to the city's Black freedom movement. Now, Fight ended up creating its own company, its own manufacturing company called Fight On, and it did this in a partnership with Xerox. And a partnership is important. This wasn't just a sort of paternalistic kind of throwaway from the Xerox Corporation. It came out of many tense negotiations between Fight and the company about what shape this manufacturer would take. Now, in doing this, Hill turns assumptions about the concept of black capitalism on their head. Fight, Hill argues, demonstrates that black capitalism had its own history among activists long before the Nixon administration sought to take that concept and sort of divert it towards its own much more conservative ends. Reverend Franklin Florence, who was Fight's leader, argued, quote, "Whites have been so obsessed by profits, they've created an insane society. We want economic development," he insisted, "but our people intend to remain human beings." Now, I think what that quote and what Hill's analysis shows is it draws this distinction between individual entrepreneurship and collective capitalism. And what we found is that for many organizations, this was a distinction that they wanted to try to maintain and figure out ways to generate this kind of collective profit and pour it back into the community. And so a lot of these essays are exploring the possibilities and also the limitations of those goals. Our second section is called Selling Women, Culture, and Black Power, and this features an article by Alexis Gumbs on the founding of Essence magazine. Essence burst onto the scene in 1970, and if you Google it, you can find its inaugural issue, which is definitely worth taking a look at. Its cover featured a luminous close-up of the model Barbara Cheeseborough, her hair styled in an iconic afro, alongside articles on romance, new careers in data processing, and revolutionary black women. Gumbs examines the gendered and ideological conflicts of the magazine's early branding. The group of male media and advertising professionals who started the magazine wanted it to serve as a gateway for markets, for companies trying to reach black consumers, and they also wanted it to be a provocative voice of black empowerment. And they often clashed with the women editors who were in charge of the magazine's content and its voice. Gumbs writes, quote, "For Essence to serve its capitalist function, it seems black women's own goals and aspirations needed to be separated from a marketable blackness. Instead, women's best interests would be marketed back to them, aesthetically rather than politically." So although Essence, the magazine's commercially driven embrace of black power, ended up sidelining black feminist voices at first, Gumbs argues that they reemerged and shaped the magazine in the 1980s when other forms of radicalism had been eclipsed. Now, the contested role played by black women in the business of black power is a theme that runs through several of these articles, and hopefully one we can talk about more later. Lindsay Feitz examines the Avon Corporation's response to Jesse Jackson's Push Coalition, when the Push Coalition demanded that the company reform its hiring and investment practices in black communities. Feitz argues that Avon was a company, with what Feitz calls an abiding historic investment in ideals of aspirational middle-class whiteness, and yet it recognized that it pays to be responsible. Avon moved beyond the token hiring policies that characterized many early corporate forays into diversity at this time. And instead, they proactively hired black saleswomen. They contracted with black-owned companies. They altered their product lines and advertising to be more inclusive and to promote a sort of variety of black beauty images promoted by the Black Power movement. But even as the corporation changed in this way in response to the critics and push, Feitz notes that Avon's successful appeals to black women consumers then also foreclosed opportunities for black-owned cosmetic firms that had serviced these customers in the past. So she kind of delves into the sort of irony of that relationship. Now, the last two sections of the book look at the shift to look at the business of housing and economic development. And actually, David wrote a piece on a tenants movement in Detroit, and he's going to talk about that in a few minutes. So I'm going to leave that to him and just touch briefly on the last section on community economic development. So in this section, this is called the business of Black power policymaking, includes essays by myself and the historian Brian Purnell. And these examine the creation of some of the most nationally influential first-generation community development corporations. Purnell focuses on the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation right across the river in Brooklyn. And I focus on 3 CDCs that emerged in Newark, New Jersey in the wake of the city's 1967 uprising. And I think both of us sort of find that CDCs advance this holistic view of economic development. And actually, one of our reviews sort of questioned whether CDCs belong in a history of business. And of course, I think Brian Purnell and I would argue that they do. But their idea was that you would combine retail businesses, services, manufacturing. You would channel the profits from these back into the community in the forms of jobs, of decent housing, and improved social services that were sort of under the control and direction of people in the community themselves. Now, in the case of Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, these groups, this group had its origins in long-standing, largely women-led practices of mutual aid and community organizing. Now, their political and financial horizons broadened in the mid-1960s when Robert Kennedy, then Senator Robert Kennedy, started looking to Bedford-Stuyvesant as the next model for the war on poverty. Purnell argues to sort of compete with Lyndon Johnson's version. And his idea was to combine new federal funding for economic development with private sector muscle. Now, at the same time, though, Purnell shows that even as this federal money and interest came into the community, it ended up sort of sidelining a lot of the local expertise, particularly that of women. And again, that's something I think that we realize really needs to be explored in the future histories of this moment and these topics. Now, CDCs were deeply pragmatic. They didn't follow a prescribed business model. For example, in my study, I found that even in a compact city like Newark, 3 groups were active in the city's central ward alone, following different ideological and strategic paths towards the similar goals that I've laid out before. These groups decried what one leader called the plantationship of Newark's downtown corporations. They criticized the displacement that government policies such as urban renewal had visited upon Black communities, and they emphasized the role of local organizations and local expertise in rebuilding neighborhood economies. Now, this keen attention to the local dynamics, I think, both explains why the CDC model was very accessible to a lot of groups and also successful. If we look around cities today, these are a well-established part of the sort of urban economic landscape. There are tens of thousands of CDCs around the country, many that have roots in this Black power moment, and many more that were started after that. But I think the local dimension also underscores the difficulty that they faced in seizing power beyond the municipal level, in addressing dimensions of racial inequality anchored in zoning laws, tax policies, and suburban political clout. So I think, I mean, there are many themes when I think about this that jump out, but I just wanted to touch on a couple. One is, as Laura mentioned, Michael O. West in his wonderful concluding essay talks about this big tent of Black power, and that essentially it was about liberation, right? And many different people coming from across the ideological spectrums embracing that. Oh, and I think I'll conclude my remarks right now. And
yeah,
oh, okay. I just have to.
You can have some of my time.
Laura left you with a few there too.
Okay, well, so it's about liberation, and for the people, the organizations in this book, this broad range of Black power organizations, liberation meant gaining and leveraging economic power, often in sort of unexpected ways and unexpected places. It meant expanding the elements of the Civil Rights Act, the Economic Opportunity Act, the expansion of the Small Business Administration, and other policies to foster independent economic growth. And a lot of these groups do this both within existing sort of conventional economic channels and totally outside of that too. So I think that's another sort of important dimension and an element of complexity to the Black power movement that I was excited to see all the scholars in this book explore. The other is I mentioned both the sexism in the movement that often sideline women entrepreneurs and women activists, but I think it's sort of important that this not be read as an absence, that when we look at these sources, the sort of involvement of women in crafting the business of Black power is another sort of significant element that I hope other scholars, and I know other scholars are continuing to explore. And I think the more that we went through this, it was really impossible to separate sort of gender from a discussion of the business of Black power. So I think, and finally, when we think about recovering sort of missing chapters in recent history, once you start delving into this, I think you look around and you see the different ways in which you see the consequences and the vestiges of a lot of this activism, even if we don't really recognize it as such. As Laura pointed out, sometimes it's the historians and scholars that are learning to ask the questions to explain the sort of world around us. And what I see is a lot of these organizations really gain momentum in the wake of the urban revolts, in the wake of the long, hot summers. And I think this is important because in the traditional sort of, encapsulated history of the United States, that's seen as a nadir in American history. But for a lot of the people on the ground, this was also a moment of major economic transformation when there was a sort of possibility to reorder the political and economic power of these cities. That doesn't mean all the attempts were successful, but I think we still live with the complexity today, and it's something that I look forward to seeing people explore further. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to say, is this on? Just wanted to say that this research is important in so many ways, but one thing that's going on here is Julia was able to interview a lot of the elders who started these who kind of pioneered these projects, and one of the major people, Gus Heningberg, just passed away. So if scholars don't interview these people, we're going to lose all of that knowledge about what happened. And I know this new generation is interested in doing business and economic development and jobs development and all that, kind of needs to know what happened in the past and what that history is. So in addition to the scholarly and all the other functions that are very important, I think for just the community's memory, it's very important. And once they're dead, it's too late. And it's kind of interesting. I think Julia might have been the only person who interviewed a lot of these people who thought it was important to get their story before it got too late, right?
A lot of them had been interviewed for different sort of college projects and things like that. So,
but not for books.
Yeah, somewhere there's probably transcripts all around northern New Jersey and people's computers and that. But
yeah. But to make this accessible is it was another reason why we're doing these programs.
And perhaps encouraging people to give their papers to libraries in their communities. And,
so I guess we're putting a plug in. If you're a student doing this kind of work, this is some important thing to put on your agenda. Without further ado,
and there's funding for it too. For
that's
state historical commissions often offer funding for students who want to help people collect their papers, catalog them, find a good library, a good home for them. But I'll stop. I'm sorry.
If you want to know more about that, talk to Julie. All right. Now, David.
All right, thank you. It's an honor to be speaking at the Schomburg. Let me just say that. And it's nice to see some of you coming out that came to see me. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to try and do a couple things. I'm going to talk about kind of the broader historical significance of not only their book. I have an article in their book, but I also have a separate book that they tie together. So I'm going to try and explain how these two things tie together, where they're more focused kind of on business. My book was more on labor. But clearly, and I'll explain this, how those two intersected in terms of people trying to seek control of community economic development. I'm quite skeptical or leery in my circumstance because of my case study to use the term black capitalism, right? Because black capitalism in the venue of Detroit might get you attacked with a hatchet if it was even implied that that's what you were trying to pursue, okay? That's not to say that people aren't operating in a capitalist milieu, but they're trying to do things in a cooperative economic ethos that they see as working against the grain as kind of, how do you survive within the oppression of racialized capitalism. But let me just kind of make 2 points, because I want to make a historical argument about what I think is so significant about these new works about Black Power, as well as the kind of big question, right, is why the hell should you all people care today, and what does it mean to us now? It's years later. Well, how many of you all live in Harlem? All right, so you all know what's going on here. I've been in Harlem for less than a year, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to walk down Frederick Douglass and see what's happening to this community, right? And as we look around, we see, you know, the new things being built. I mean, no offense to some of you all, but maybe some of you all don't want to go to a shop where you have to pay $25 for a beer. I know I didn't when I was here, but meaning things in Harlem are changing, the demographics are clearly changing, and we see kind of urban reconstruction taking place, right? And oftentimes as I would walk to the Schomburg to do my research, I'm very cognizant of who was doing that work. Right, so as kind of money's pouring into this community and people are being forced out, what happens to the existing population, right? How do they establish a route for themselves, right? How do they kind of make that land their land and protect themselves from gentrifiers, right? And how do they seek benefit from the dollars that are coming in? And these are precisely kind of the questions that people were trying to deal with in the 1960s. And if you think of gentrification today, think about back then, you're talking about even more money, and most of the money is funneled through the federal government, through urban renewal programs, right? So people are trying to get a gauge as to how do we then take these resources. The federal government essentially funded white flight, funded suburbanization. How do black people then channel kind of these dollars and not only take them into the black community on capitalistic principles, whereas a few people become very wealthy building things for black people, but then how do you use that to create community development, right, where things get spread around and it's not based on the principle of, you know, one or two people making as much money as possible. Now, when I was looking at this, I was looking at particularly this issue of construction trades, right? Now, construction trades are very important because as jobs were declining in industry, construction was still rampant, right? As people were rebuilding schools, hospitals, and what have you, rebuilding inner cities, highways in the 50s and the 60s. And what I was trying to look at is, so as the jobs that people of color had occupied were disappearing because of automation, right? What avenues did people have towards better paid skilled work, right? And how could they then take that work in their own community and use that as a nexus for development? And what started, and what I was looking at, was people were trying to gain control not over the business per se, but over access to labor. But in construction, the access to labor is controlled by business, right? Meaning you're hired through a union who works in cahoots with a contractor. So oftentimes you see these black contractors, and black people wind up being contractors because that's the only way that they can secure work, right? They're a small company of one or two people and they book small jobs. But what they couldn't do is compete on the larger federally funded construction projects, right? So in my kind of milieu, that's what I was trying to look at, is how people are going around kind of the racist trade unions, trying to get community control of not only the construction jobs, but also over the design on what redevelopment was going to look like and who it was going to benefit, right? So therefore, if people start to rehab houses in Harlem, the idea would be to ensure that those houses are for existing residents and low-income residents if possible, right? But then how do you work that out within this broader system? And that's kind of what, you know, our work was trying to do. And of course, this dovetails nicely with business because you have to, if you're a construction worker, work for a company that is, you know, able to put up bonding and money for these construction projects. So one of the most important things that I think is happening with the Black Power literature that's been coming out lately, and you all mentioned this before, is this notion of normally, maybe like 5 years ago, when you think about Black Power, you'd think of Angela Davis and the Black Panther Party, right? Malcolm X, maybe League of Revolutionary Black Workers if you were getting real deep. But I mean, it became a few iconic figures, right? What we didn't understand, and I think what was misrepresented, was the nature of kind of what civil rights historians have called organizing tradition, right? Meaning sometimes Black Power activists are just depicted as kind of loud rebel rousers that don't really have a following, but they're just talking hellish shit and have pretty cool uniforms on, and they're put up in front of cameras. And they're dismissed as such. But I think what this work really shows you is the grassroots connection that Black Power activists had on the ground, an organizing tradition, if you will, and that it's much more diverse than we originally thought. this idea of, I think you guys used the word umbrella organization, or Michael West does. The lingo of the time, right, was that people were forming black united fronts, right? Meaning you could be a moderate, a militant, a socialist, a communist, a nationalist, cultural nationalist. Generally speaking, the idea was, though, if you were opposed to quote unquote Negro activists and you wanted something more militant, you could then join this broader Black United Front to push for something more substantive. Now, normally what this entailed was an attack on institutionalized racism, right? And this is why the economics of Black Power is so important, because at the heart of the critique of institutionalized racism, right, is the economic impulse of racial capitalism, right? This is what brings King to the sanitation workers in '68. This brings me to the Poor People's Campaign, right? So this is kind of the buildup, and people are working on these economic issues. Now, I'm not going to talk too much directly about construction, but I want to kind of make a polemical point and then talk about my article for their book. The polemical point is this, originally Black Power in terms of a social movement is rooted in the interests of the inner city, right? It's a turn away from integration, seeking access to Westchester or wherever it is, and a focus on building and solidifying the inner city community. And when we talk about the inner city community and blackness, we're not just talking about all black folks generally, because the black middle class has an opportunity at this point in urban history to kind of move towards the outskirts. So there's even a bifurcation within the black community. You're talking about the poor and the working class within black communities, right? And I think that's kind of significant, because this is a moment in which people are really kind of focused on inner city development and inner city issues, and that's kind of the general turn that people are making. Now, I think what happens with Black Power and what we're trying to argue in our book is that this focus on kind of working class issues, on jobs, really starts as the MO for the movement. But what happens is, and I believe you referred to it with Nixon, is within this big tent, right, the problems of all these people who are unified in fighting against white supremacy come to a head once money becomes involved, right? You know, money starts getting people acting funny, right? So all of a sudden you have people before, and I'll give you the example of Detroit, like I said, people wouldn't proclaim black capitalism at all. You had to be of and for the people and for the betterment of the whole community. If you weren't talking that prior to 1969, you were going to get run from the movement. But when people start to cut checks is when people could then define who was going to be included in Black Power. So I think what happens is, in my piece, what I look at is who, in many ways, the people who have the money, in this case the government, federal funders, pick winners and losers, right? And there's this dialectic between kind of a working class-based Black Power movement and kind of this business class, and ultimately the people who bring the movement are ultimately displaced by the people who are elevated. And I think what you get is this kind of metaphor for what happens to black urban regimes like Detroit, right? In the sense that you have kind of militant rhetoric that is replaced by people who are focused on creating Black Power, not from the way that people had intended initially from the bottom up, but they subvert it by trying to assert a notion of Black Power from the bottom down. What do I mean by this? In the terms of construction, instead of saying, okay, we're going to fight for this many jobs and jobs in our community, the impulse then, once the government and funding sources comes, is to then say, we're going to focus on black contractors. And then the black contractors are then responsible for trickling down the economic benefit to black workers. But those black workers never come, right? And oftentimes those black contractors, people like Ward Connerly and others, David Bing in Detroit, who's now our de facto, not even a mayor, I don't even know what he is. He has an office now, but he's somebody that made money off of set-aside contracts, right? But none of that ever kind of got through. And basically what they became were figureheads, right? They got money diverted to them, and they worked with white companies, and they employed their employees. So you had a notion of symbolic power, but it never got to the grassroots, which is where the movement had grown out of. So in many ways, I think that's kind of my general argument in both my piece in that book and kind of in the Black Power at Work, is that when the federal government becomes involved, it displaces a certain group with a certain group of people that will put a symbolic representation on it, but nothing tangible. And Black Power's economics was all about dealing with the tangible impact of institutional racism. I have more time?
The buzzer hasn't gone off yet.
Yeah?
Let's see what's cooking here. All right.
We're going to clap.
We got 4 minutes.
What's that?
We got 4 minutes. We have time to hear. We got 4
Let
minutes.
me just kind of give a brief overview of my piece for their book. I was looking at a group called United Tenants for Collective Action. And I think it has saliency for today in terms of Harlem. United Tenants is a group of, that was associated with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. And basically what they were doing were fighting slumlords. And what happened in Detroit is you had a few people that had bought up a lot of the inner city property. And because of urban renewal, they weren't doing anything. Like there are horrible stories about, like dust that's causing people to get like sick, babies dying, rats bitten, all over Detroit. And the point is that these slumlords were trying to not fix their properties on purpose to get slum clearance money, right? And it caused a lot of harm. And meanwhile, because blacks were segregated, the rent doubled and tripled, right? So people had organized citywide, as they had in New York with Jesse Gray and other places. And they started this movement. Now, the idea was to kind of force the hand of the city to enforce building codes. And they fought a long campaign, and ultimately they altered the kind of codes about building. And all these builders started finally getting to court and started to be fined. And it's at that moment, right, that the owners say, oh, shit, we have to, pay for this, and it's not worth it anymore. So what they do is they gave the property to the tenants themselves to organize cooperative housing. So black people would have control of their housing and control of their land. Now, in the moment of kind of community control and the internal colonization thesis, this sounds like a wonderful idea. The city is the black man's land, let's own it. The problem was the landlords were very clear that it didn't make economic sense to do so. And now they're legally on the hook to fix the buildings. So when they gave these properties to this tenants' rights group, then all of a sudden, they had a commitment to build low-income housing, but they also had to fix all these things and were already in debt, right? So in many ways, this was an example or a way in which white people who created the problem were able to leave the city, leave black people to pay the bill and wash their hands of it, right? That's what I mean about a metaphor about how kind of white people wash their hands of the so-called urban crisis and then put the onus on black people and then blame them for it. This is precisely what happened as this failed endeavor to create cooperative housing went down in Detroit. I'll stop there.
Well, let me just say that part of the piece that happens has to be linked with, you kind of see deindustrialization happening earlier in these communities. I think that's a big part of the story. And it almost makes you think about the Booker T. Washington moment about when you want to be separate. You don't want to be separate, if you're into being separate. You don't want to be separate in a moment of technological change, right? So many of the businesses that black Muslims got, that many of us got, were businesses that white people wanted to sell because the technology was dated, right? So we bought over the African Printing Cooperative. I remember we had the African Printing Cooperative. I guess that egg is cooked.
You gotta give yourself more time.
All right. The new printing business across the street, before we could ink up our machines to do a job, they would finish the job, right? And so this is a moment, we have to remember that this is a moment of dramatic, we're in the middle of that kind of moment now, right? And so you don't want to be, so a lot of those businesses, we need to really look at those and see how long they lasted, but they were not profitable.
But that's
And plus, you cannot deliver the service if you're trying to help the community. You're not going to be able to give them the lower prices that you really wanted them to do. And the other thing with the stores, part of it is also us learning about the economy, right? So we had a cooperative store, and we found out that based on I don't want to go into the technical stuff about warehousing and different markets and stuff like that, but basically we found out that the price that the jobber would give us for a case of sodas was higher than the one on the shelf at the supermarket, right? So in the beginning when we want liberation, we want economic development. But let's remember, we're segregated people, just like with political power. We didn't know anything about political power because we never had it, right? And so part of it is your learning curve and finding out how the economy is actually working in the city and what's really going on. And we found out a lot about those markets and things like that. So, and I guess that should be part of the story too, is how we learned about how the economy. I would say on the black contractors, though, we found that when we were doing the stuff with the contractors that, and I hope this is not the case these days, but on Friday would almost be like riots at a lot of the construction
To make sure they
sites
get
because
paid.
black workers wouldn't get paid.
Yes. This is tied to what I was talking about. Is the same problem you're talking about is black business is hampered, of course, because you're undercapitalized.
Right.
Right, so meaning if you're undercapitalized, you can't get bonded for a proper job, meaning they're working kind of check to check just like you are. So it was always tenuous.
Or even worse, underbidding.
Yes, and underbidding, but one of the ways that the whites would try and get after people that were trying to hire black trade unions, and this happened in Detroit, was they knew that they were short on cash. And they know if somebody's short on cash and you can't get paid, people aren't going to show up. So the white tradesmen would go in along with the Teamsters and mob members at a job site and go into the plumbing stacks and pour cement down them at black-owned rehab jobs, thinking that you don't have the money to cover the expense of pulling up all the and they were right. That basically broke one of these kind of consortiums of black workers and black tradespeople. So that lack of kind of capital access, and part of it shows you kind of the nexus between civil rights and black power is Herbert Hill actually in the NAACP worked with black contractors to try and create a consortium to allow them to create a bidding firm where they could raise larger bonds so they could get these larger projects and have more capitalization to compete.
Yeah. Well, what I saw working let's go from the workers' point of view. The sad thing is black workers back then on construction sites, and I don't know what the case is now, no one would hire them but the black contractors.
Yes, that's the only way you could get it.
Okay? The other piece you got going is when we went to the union hall, you go to laborers hall, everybody in the labor hall had a skill. They were really carpenters, electricians, and plumbers, but the only union book they could get was general labor. So when you look at the statistics, we really need to doubt those statistics about unskilled labor.
Sure.
You assume that you're in the labor hall because you don't have a skill.
Sure.
But I used to go to labor hall and interview people, and they would tell you what their trade was, right? But the other thing is if the black contractor is not paying the workers on a regular basis, then they're losing their homes.
Sure.
They can't pay the bills. So we decided that we had to firm up the black contractors
Sure.
in order to help the black workers.
Right?
And we taught them how to bid, that they had to have a broader margin and things like that. Because I don't know whether you know what's going on here, but black contractors, and maybe other people were doing this too, were systematically underbidding on each job, which meant that they would run out of money before the job was over. And then chaos going on, and black workers were catching the hell for it because they would suddenly not have a job, couldn't pay their bills and stuff like that. So we decided to set up a cooperative contractors things, I think we called it Coast Construction Company, to teach and taught them how to bid. And even after we were teaching them how to bid and showing them how much money was in the budget, they would typically, habitually try to underbid that. And in one case, we were the developer. We said, look, I'm telling you, there's $200,000 in the budget. Come in at 200. Don't come in at 100,000, and then you can't pay the workers, right? So I think it was like this chain that they were really connected to each other. I think we should probably open this up for comments and discussions. I think there's going to be a gentleman with the mic here. This light is rough here.
I have a comment and a question. And my issue kind of dovetails Dr. Goldberg.
Yep.
Yes. And this is based, I'm not a researcher, I'm in business now, but I've lived through a lot of this period.
Yeah.
And so it's based more on life experience. So what I'm looking at is, I grew up in Africa, but I came here when I was a teenager. And I look at this, and part of the business of black power, the beneficiaries have been the people who are not intended to be. And really, the sad part of it, I say that because I'm a certified minority business owner in New York City. And about a year ago, we were in the Javits Center. I look around and see who's certified, who is this minority, people who have nothing to do with this historical oppression. You know, people from Ghana, from China, from India, and this made up about 90% of who was in the room. And it saddens me because this was kind of paid with the sweat and blood of black folks who opened up the avenue for everybody else, except that like the last beneficiaries of all this struggle that has gone into it. So, and there is, just from a business point of view, it didn't have to be that way, you know. Why, how can somebody from Latvia get ahead of somebody who lived in Harlem for 30, 50 years or came from Alabama? Somehow these deals are structured in such a way they do not take into account the people who've been historically disadvantaged at this. So this is the comment part. The question is, in terms of research going forward, this is a very practical issue, again, you know, whether it's community development, regentrification, are people researching this, not just old history only, but how resources that were intended to right historical wrongs have been diverted to groups that have absolutely nothing to do with this in the name of political correctness. And to quantify this, you know, how much of this resource, whether in the name of affirmative action, black empowerment, all these enterprises, have gone to enrich unintended groups and individuals. Thank you.
I mean, I think I would start by saying, I don't actually think that money was ever intended to get to any particular group. I think that money was intended to stop urban uprisings, to defang the Black Power movement, and to really divide the community. And one of the things that we really saw throughout our entire collection is how divisive this issue was. I mean, I think David said, you know, people start acting funny when money is involved. And we see that in community after community, that once the money was involved, everybody had different ideas about what should happen with that money, and it starts to fizzle. But I disagree, actually, that anybody who had the money, that ever intended to do anything with that money, was trying to right wrongs. I really think that money was meant to settle things down a little in a really volatile kind of moment.
I would agree with that. They used to refer to kind of the origins of affirmative action or some of these programs as riot insurance, right?
Absolutely, that's what they call it in Rochester.
And that's, you see a couple things with that is that this was clearly a plan for pacification. And then when it happens, and then kind of when they could get a gauge on it, then it's what I was talking about before, they pick the specific winners they want to deal with, and kind of the people that brought these issues to the fore all of a sudden get dropped out of the scene. So then you get this rise of black power as black capitalism through Nixon, through James Brown, whoever it is that's, you know, making these claims, you know, and people get displaced. And as a result of that, like I said before, it kind of becomes more symbolic. You're a black business owner, a contractor, it doesn't matter who you hire, right? But as long as somebody's getting some kind of money, that's seen as a symbolic victory. Now, I will say this, because this is a different situation today when you're dealing with construction. You know, the unions have been decimated by and large measure in the construction trades. And I think, you know, if going forward, what we have to look at, there truly is that historical oppression that you speak of, but how do we then deal with these issues of, it's not only just the people from you know, who are here and working. The question is, there are tons of people out of work in New York that have skills and, like you said, that don't have their card, but you know, are tremendously talented in terms of skills and could easily become journeymen, right? But aren't ever given this opportunity. And I think if the mobilizing force back then was to organize based on race, and this way, kind of, you have to look at place, right? Because what happens is, in a place like New York, to underbid people, they bring people from down south, and they have them come up and they have them work very cheaply. So, I mean, you know, I would love to see, if you're looking at Harlem now, it's one thing to say black, but Harlem is such a diverse community now, right? So if you're fighting for jobs here, it's imperative to say Harlem jobs for Harlem people. Not the people that are coming in 20 years, but the people that are here. You know, a Harlem investment for Harlem people. You know, not a mythical Harlem for people that plan to come later. But in that way, kind of that place-based organizing, I think, could have an important role today.
Well, I would say, though, there is an anti-black part. I'll talk about New York in particular. Because my school, when we pushed them on diversity, there's a lot of brown people that they have there, none of them black.
Right.
And that's why when you look at the numbers, you have this extraordinary high unemployment rate for Harlem. So everybody's saying that they're hiring people, but, you know, so when you define affirmative action or diversity, whatever term, it's a power question about who's defining what that means.
Sure.
Right.
And the big thing to put people asleep is to tell them, you've won this victory, the struggle's over. Right? If you believe that, you've lost the game no matter what the terms are, because they're sitting there defining what it is, and it's not going to be in your interest. So that's the big thing. I think people have to really, even among professors I see this, people think, oh, it's an academic thing, so it's no longer political. It's always political. It's always political. And let's remember, a lot of these people, I would say the old black business class did not benefit from most of this affirmative action.
No.
Okay? What you had, I remember we had a black electrical firm that was helping build the African Free School and a lot of things in the community. We tried to upgrade the guy to get the electrical contract to build a big apartment building. So we were doing mix and match. We teamed him up with a white contractor. No, I'm sorry. It was a black electrical contractor from New York. So after a year of agreement and everything's going to go down with this partnership of our small black guy who's going to employ people from the community and the big black guy from New York, we have a meeting in the cafeteria, and the guy gives me, I think he was showing me something like $60,000. So I said, well, what is this for? He said, you got to get rid of him. Right? So basically he's saying he didn't want to partner with the small contractor and stuff like that. So I said, I'm sorry to inform you, but he's in. It's you that's in question, right? Now, the guy from New York was fronting for a big white electrical thing. So it's hard to say. I would say 99% of those people were front people. So what happened, you had political patronage on the one hand, with who got these contracts and things like that, or it was the same white businessmen that were there who would hire a person. And I think you talked about Rent a Negro kind of a program where the same black person would go around fronting for different white contractors.
Well, and you had the problem on the union side too, meaning if you didn't work with the proper contractor that the unions would vet, then they'd shut that contractor down or give them grief at a job site or shut it down. So they had economic impulse to make sure that the workforce remained white too.
Yeah. Let's say this, if you're mobilizing communities, it's much easier to mobilize with the black-white confrontation, and you got masses of people. Once you get into the bureaucratic and business channels, it's very difficult to mobilize the community in that. We got to work on that, because that's where the nitty-gritty happens, unless you get freedom now. And, you know, like I said, I never demanded affirmative action. We were demanding freedom now. Affirmative action was like freedom sometime later. And it turns out never at all. Right? So, but that whole waiting game is to demobilize the movement,
Right.
so that you're not there. So if you don't get it on that first day of the struggle, you're not going to get it next year. You don't trust me and things like that. That never, I don't think that worked for any of these communities. Was there another hand out there? Sorry.